everyone, welcome back to That Heathen Bastard. Remember, this is a channel for talking points in politics. This is not a news show. If you want news, watch Tim Pool, Sticks, Hex, and Hammer 666, or Black Conservative Perspective. Thank you. With that being said, I'd like to begin this video sort of fixing some of the confusion, or addressing some of the confusion some viewers have had, because this is about talking points and conversations. That's what this channel is. So, to remedy some of the confusion, I wanted to discuss my personal politics, my ideology, which I'm still working on my understanding of. My ideology is unique to me, and I may convince others to adopt it in the future. This is called Reformed Conservatism, which has two definitions. The first definition being a rejection of neoconservatism and traditional conservatism. And the second definition being that it's a marrying up of pre-Christian Western values with Enlightenment-era rationalism. I am a rationalist. I believe rationalism is the future, and I think that anyone who guides their actions more by emotional feelings and narratives are a throwback to the way things were before. They're a throwback to the witch hunts, to, the satanic panic, to the irrational sort of, hysteria. Because the thing about human emotion is that human emotion can be manipulated, right? And feelings are often inconsistent. They can change. Logic, on the other hand, never changes. As long as you observe it correctly, logic is uniform. It's unchanging, unshifting. It is the truth. And narratives can be lies. So having an emotional narrative is not really the best basis for guiding one's actions, which is why rationalism came about in the first place. The first historical figure to be a rationalist, famously, I believe, or one of the first, was King James I of England. And by modern standards, he's considered to be not even that good at being a rationalist. Right? He's in the right direction, but he's not quite there yet. That's why it's important to be a rationalist in the first place. Marrying that up with a pre-Christian Western tradition because, Tiwaz, I am a pagan. I developed my own political ideology because there's not a conservative ideology pre-extant that serves all my interests. There's some that serve some, but not all. So I need to make my own. And I need to encourage others to adopt my ideas or similar ideas. That means putting them out there, which is what this is about. This is about developing ideas and developing platforms. That's what I'm doing here. That means I am talking, I am teaching, I am debating, I am engaging. I engage in the comments, I engage people. Anybody who says anything overtly hateful or tries to start something will be removed, absolutely. Your ass is going to get blocked, I don't fucking care. You're going to be in the abyss. You won't exist as far as I'm concerned. You will know my revenge by my cold indifference. But that's what I do. I debate, I inform, I educate, unless, of course, you're going to say something openly hateful, as I just explained. Now, the nature of conservatism is rooted in the idea of conserving something, conservatorship, and then passing on to the next generation. This is something not well understood by some people because they think of it in terms of sort of nifty 50s style, almost NIMBYism, right? They think of it in those terms. That's really not what conservatism is supposed to be. In particular, checking my backdrop. That's not necessarily what it's supposed to be. In particular, it's supposed to be about conservatorship, not about NIMBYism. A lot of people tend to think of it that way, which is an absurdity. They want to focus in on some, weird fringe radicals and think they're normal. Right? That's sort of the tribalistic call to zoom in on the weirdos so closely that you can't see the normal people because you're so zoomed in. With the binoculars, when you zoom in on your binoculars, you get so close that after a while, everything else just disappears. That's sort of where they're coming from, I think. Maybe not entirely, but that is definitely part of it. That is to say, the problem with leftists and progressives in this conversation is that they tend to make use of a lot of cliches, right? They use cliches to talk about conservatism. They don't use facts. They don't make observations. They do not act as a scientist or philosopher. They act as someone who relies on the usage of cliches to use that as somehow the truth, right? So they think of conservatism as NIMBYist, pro-life, pro-border, anti-immigration, racist, pro-slavery, etc. They think in terms of associations. They think in terms of cliches. Or imperialism. That's one they sometimes go to, is imperialism. And as long as they continue to use cliches and refuse to actually ask the conservative about what they actually think and what they actually believe, then they will fail to understand and they will harm the conversation. And their failure to understand will only compound their continual use of cliches and their continual harm within the debate. Now, what really makes a conservative down the line, other than a conservatorship, typically is patriotism. A dedication to your nation. Not to rhyme, but there you go. It is a dedication to the patriotic nature of your sort of tribal identity with the country. You support the country, you love it, and you want others to love it too. That is not to say that a left-winger can't be patriotic, but you can't be right-wing and not patriotic. It is basically a requirement. That's just all there is to it. Because the approach of the right wing is to essentially know the system, analyze the system, and use it, rather than always constantly changing it. Instead of changing the system, you know the system and use it to get what you want. So our approach to, say, ending segregation is not to change the system, but to use the system. Right? This is a very systematic sort of approach that requires that you sort of think like a chess player. You use the rules of the game to achieve victory. And this is often why right-wing politicians are a little further ahead of the game. And to define right-wing is somewhat difficult, but generally speaking, I think an agreeable definition would be tradition versus change. Right-wing is tradition, left-wing is change. Right-wing tends to keep things a little bit more the same, and left-wing tries to keep everything a little bit more different. So conservatism and right-wing is like butter and toast. You can sort of be a conservative. You can put things into your conservatorship if you're left-wing. Because technically a lot of left-wingers engage in climate activism. Or maybe not climate activism, but nature conservationism. Nature conservation has the word conserve right in it. Right? The root word of conservative and conservatorship is conserve. By engaging in nature conservation, you're engaging in a conservative action, whether you realize it or not. You are engaging in a conservative action. You are conserving nature and passing it on to the next generation. And you probably don't even think of it that way. So you're actually you're being a conservative, but also left-wing. So that's very interesting. So you can be patriotic and more or less conservative if you're left-wing, but left-wing means you're more about change. If you're right-wing, you're more about keeping things more or less the same. So that requires conservatorship and patriotism. It's needed. Now, this is where we get into the meat of the issue, is thinking in terms of definitions versus thinking in terms of associations. Most people think in terms of associations. I tend to think in terms of definitions. I am not an academic, but I've always wanted to be. I'm not quite up to snuff to, say, go to a place like Oxford or Cambridge or any of the big schools here in America. But I want as much of that world in me as I can possibly get, because I love it. And people who think in that academic mindset, they don't think in terms of associations, they think in terms of definitions. The root of conservative is conserve. The definition of conserve is to conserve and pass on to the next generation, to protect. Therefore, it is not necessarily NIMBYist, pro-life, etc. It can be, but not necessarily. If you continue to think of only in terms of associations and only in terms of cliches, then you will miss the mark time and time again. And the same goes for many right-wingers who think of homosexuality in terms of cliches. They think of, sex in the butt and so forth. They don't think of all the guys who actually don't like that stuff, right? There's lots of dudes who don't really care for that kind of activity and don't engage in queer culture. That's something the right does as well, so we can't entirely blame the left. And that was just an arbitrary example. I'm not striking up a conversation about that. It was just arbitrary. So ultimately, the idea of conservatorship really means that we're preserving the spirit of our culture and tradition. We are keeping it alive, and as it evolves and it changes over time, we bring it into the modern century. In order for something to survive, it has to evolve, or it's simply going to die. That's how life works. You adapt to changing situations, you adapt to changing circumstances, or you die. Therefore, to conserve tradition, it has to be allowed to evolve. It has to adapt to changing circumstances, and it has adapted to changing times. We can't necessarily always do it in the exact same way we did before. We can keep the tradition, but we have to make certain modifications so it suits now. So that's sort of my political, that's how I am. That is my conservatorship. That is conservativeness in general. And if you want to talk about the different varieties of conservatism, you want to talk about traditional conservatism, which is the four pillars, Judeo-Christian values, American exceptionalism, this is God's country, etc., etc. That tends to be more NIMBYist, that tends to be more racist and more sexist. Because whether they want to admit it or not, the Christians want to admit it, Christian culture created a lot of racism and sexism. Whether they want to admit that or not, it absolutely did. Right, there's a long history of Christian anti-Semitism and a long history of saying that, woman is secondary to man. That man is the head of the body of the body of Christ. That man is the head and woman is the foot or something, or the chest because she came from the rib. Right, and then neoconservatism is compromise, diplomacy. Let's talk it out. Let's make a deal. Let's give you a little bit of what we want. Let's give you a little bit of what you want. Let's take a little bit of what we want. And let's keep the peace. The problem is that they make too many compromises with neoconservatism. They make too many compromises and they bend the knee on too many things. They can sometimes look like tradcons. They can be sort of American exceptionalism. They can be sort of that. But most of the time, they're not. Most of the time, they're typically only Nixon could go to China. This is the way. This is how we negotiate for the things we want. And then, of course, there's the current right-wing populism movement, which is America first. We be for the people. Donald Trump or anybody similar to Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis is popular. That's the current right-wing movement that's slowly taking over. And it's making good progress. And I would say that my ideology encompasses that to an extent. It encompasses elements of it, and I'm right there with the populists on most of the issues. You know, the ideology I'm trying to create, this sort of reformed conservatism, is mostly for people who only have some of their interests served by traditional conservatism in America. That being said, people who are raised right wing and believe in right wing ideas, but accept the opposite notion of America, that it's not a Christian country, but a secular country based on Enlightenment rationalism and freedom of religion, freedom of expression, or just freedom, period. This means you can be any religion you want, you can say what you want, you can do what you want. This is sort of a right libertarian idea. Right? The problem with libertarianism being that it really only has one core value, which is freedom. That's not enough. You also need to have respect for authority. You need law and order to an extent. You need to actively protect society to some extent. Because you can't leave absolutely everything to the forces at work or to the forces that be. Some things you have to actively protect, and you can't do that with a purely libertarian direction. So the ideology agrees with populism, agrees with libertarianism, but it also agrees to some extent with a kind of traditional conservatism. It also technically supports LGBTQ to an extent because it was normal in Western civilization, that is homosexual union, that is two men or two women, was perfectly normal in Western civilization for hundreds of years until Christianization. And if we are to marry pre-Christian Western tradition with Enlightenment rationalism, then we must accept the old tradition of homosexual union, which is not expressly immoral. We can reject those things that are expressly immoral and do not preserve those traditions, but preserve their memory only. That's another thing people don't understand. You don't conserve absolutely everything about your culture. If you made a mistake, you admit you made a mistake, and you preserve the memory of that thing instead of the thing itself. We say, we did this once, and it was really bad. Right? That's how you conserve it. You conserve its memory so that nobody forgets. Turning the Nazi concentration camps into a museum was actually a conservative action. You're conserving the memory of the camps. So that's actually a very conservative action. We conserve the memory of human sacrifice, but we don't do it. We conserve the memory of, but we don't do it. And we conserve the things that are not objectively harmful. People have tried to claim that homosexuality is somehow harmful, but they fail to provide evidence. We ask them for evidence time and time again, and they fail to come up with anything. Right? So we preserve that tradition. It's going to have to adapt for the times, to evolve and to adapt to our current time. The tradition of Western homosexual union will have to change. And how exactly it's going to have to change is going to have to be a discussion for another time, because that's a fairly complex issue. Anyway, I hope that really clears some of the confusion that some of you might have had in general. So that is how we do it here on That Heathen Bastard. So with that being said, there'll be a link down below in the description to my books. Please buy, download, and read them. And as always, tschüss, peace.